Welcome to Three Thoughts On. Today, I am delighted to have my friend John back and the podcast. John, how are you doing today?
Excellent, Raphael. It's so happy to be back to speak with you again, to go back and forth, have some nice exchanges on topics that we love.
Fantastic. Well, for those of us who don't know, for those of you, I should say, that who don't know, John and I have three episodes towards the beginning of my podcast where we talk about effective communications and how to do better at communicating with other people, how to speak, how to listen, and how to interact. And today we're going to continue with that conversation. So I'll just turn it over to you, John, so that we can get started on today's conversation.
So I'm glad to be back. And if I could offer this to you, I think to give a refresher with what we've talked about in the past, we've talked about how to argue better and given some suggestions on that. We've talked about how the ancients practiced it, the Greeks and the Romans. We've talked about how Aristotle shaped it for us. We've also talked about how leaders such as Lincoln, Caesar, FDR, MLK used it. We've referenced terms like ethos, pathos, logos, kairos, telos to give some ideas about how to argue better and to make your argumentation effective. What I'd like to do now, if it's okay with you, is to discuss with you some real life examples, and we'll hyper focus on the Lincoln Douglas debates in the 1850s at this point, to give an idea of two individuals applying these principles, bringing in very different backgrounds and very different ideas to the discussion.
No, that sounds great. I think I personally was not aware of the Lincoln and Douglas debates until you taught me about it. So I like to believe that I'm a student of history, and I was completely unaware of these debates. I mean, obviously, everybody knows who Abraham Lincoln was and all the wonderful things he did, but very few know about how he came up and how he got to the point of becoming president of the United States. And learning from you, these debates that he had with Stephen Douglas were pivotal into that path and that journey that he took. So please carry on.
So, just to give everyone a reminder, Lincoln at the time, these debates happened from, I believe it was August through October of 1858. What's going on in the country is Douglas, who was a judge at the time, is running for a Senate seat. Lincoln is challenging him for that Senate seat. And what triggered that was Lincoln realizing that the country is not going the right way with slavery. If we go back a couple of years from 1858, we have 1850 with the Compromise of 1850. So basically, what we're trying to do is we're having a lot of individuals, spearheaded by Henry Clay, trying to compromise and have the North and the South work together to stay together as long as possible, realizing, though, that slavery has changed. It's not the necessary evil, but the idea to get rid of it that some of the founding fathers thought of, that this would be done with, hundreds of years before that. They're now realizing that there are attempts now to keep slavery going by compromise. That's what happened with 1850. It started with the Missouri Compromise back in 1819, 1820. It's 30 years later, and they're still compromising over slavery. Lincoln's concerned that it's going to be spreading forever at this point. You have a Kansas-Nebraska Act that happens in 1854. And now you're having an agitation going where Douglas is under the platform that he wants to continue slavery through popular sovereignty, meaning that constitutionally you can't prevent it. You now have a Fugitive Slave Act that's in effect at this point also, which allows slave owners to track down their slaves and to require Northerners or other states that don't have slavery to return the slaves. And now you have Douglas pushing what's saying that through popular sovereignty, you could actually have the people in a certain territory decide whether they want slavery or not. This is not the right direction. Lincoln realizes this. He wants that Senate seat. He wants to make a difference again. At the time, he's a one-term congressman, and he thought he'd practice law for the rest of his life. He was very good at that, but he realizes now that I have to make a difference, and my country needs me. And thank God that he did. So these debates just to give everyone a reminder, it's for the Senate seat. Lincoln loses. Uh, he loses the Senate seat. He loses that campaign, but he puts himself on a national circuit for the presidency.
Well, thank you for that background. Yes, these compromises, like you said, they seem to have been going for quite some time, and it seemed that, like, on paper, they were just that, a compromise. And when I look at the word compromise, I don't think of 90-10. I think of 50-50, right? But once you zoom out and look into the details, it was definitely not 50-50. It was more of a compromise on paper that, when implemented, wasn't really much of a compromise. And I guess, for the purposes of this discussion, that is exactly at the essence of what we're talking about, of how to communicate, how to debate, how to bring attention to issues that are of importance for the common good, but do that in such a way that it leads to outcomes that are beneficial for society as a whole. So I'm glad that you brought this up, because I think that's one of the things that we struggle with today. We see a lot of, whether it's legislation or whether it's executive orders by the president, uh, that are celebrated because of what they look like on paper. But when you read them and you go through them, you see the emptiness in them. You see that they don't really get much done, or they're just reiterating something that was already done prior, or they're encouraging, I'm sorry, for people to do something, or institutions to do something that was already established in a previous legislation. So we, as citizens in this country, need to be aware of that. And all of the stuff, all the work that we've done in the three prior episodes and that we're going to get into now is specifically for that. Is we need to learn how to speak with intention, or I should say relearn, because I believe that at one point in time as a society we did better. We also need to relearn how to listen to each other better, but we also need to learn how to properly consume the information that's in front of us, so that we don't become misled by very empty pieces of paper that are self-aggrandizing. Did I put that in context there?
Absolutely. You nailed it. Part of what we're doing today, I think, and hopefully the people listening will benefit from this, is we want to take some theoretical terms that we've talked about. We've given some bits of real life examples of it and real life figures who have used these uh, traditional argumentation methods to their benefit. Most of them politicians, some of them advocates, some of them civil rights advocates, MLK, for example. This is important because now we have the interaction of the audience with your opponent, too. We don't just have one person in a monologue giving a presentation like an FDR speech, like a MLK speech. We actually have two individuals who are using these principles against each other, trying to convince an audience about their principles and here to get reelected to the Senate. But it's having more than that, though. This is what this really is. It's the Constitution versus popular sovereignty at this point. And it's a timeless concept. We've seen that happen in real life ourselves here fairly recently. The Constitution versus popular sovereignty for abortion, for example, very heated topics here that are going to influence where we are at this point. And having the audience interact is very important because remember, these are speeches, these aren't debates that we see on the TV now where you have it tried to be controlled by news organizations where they ask one question and they try to go down the line and they're interrupting each other. And that gets frustrating, I think, from a modern standpoint. These are debates. I'll take you back. These are debates. They're dirty. They're funny. They're ribald. You have drunk people in the audience. This is in the territories. People are traveling for miles to be entertained by these individuals. And they are. To give you an example, it's an hour-long opening. You start. So Douglas would speak for an hour, and then Lincoln would speak for an hour. There'd be a half-hour response. There'd be a half-hour rebuttal. They would challenge their positions. They would bring in comedy to it. Sometimes they would repeat what they said at a prior debate. Remember, these are 7 debates lasting from August to October of 1858. So many times they'll be speaking at a different location that they didn't get word of the speech. No one took it down. No one remembered stuff. And they'd have to repeat some of the elements there. But this is a lot. You're asking a lot about an individual because they're on the stage for a very long period of time. They have to be funny. They have to be convincing. They have to apply all these principles that we talked about. There has to be credibility to their speech. There has to be some passion and emotion there. There has to be a logical element, the logo section. There has to have good timing there. That's the kairos. And what's your goal or purpose? Other than being elected, you want to present something in a way where the audience could accept it and elect you and realize, yes, I want to be able to say or not say that slavery should be in my territory, or no, I don't. It's a constitutional issue. So that's the telos part of it too. It gets all of this together, but it gets it in a real life dirty ring. I mean, this was TV at the time. This was wrestling at the time. And when we think of wrestling, it's funny. There were times when Lincoln would be giving a speech, he'd realize his friend was out in the crowd, getting roughed up. He'd stop, he'd go there, he'd throw the individuals away from his friend and get back on the stage and start going through these principles again. So it was a wild time, but it was a very important time for the country too, Raphael.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, let's get into the meat of it. And just to remind folks, John and I have had 3 conversations prior. I encourage you to go back to those episodes for the details of the Aristotelian principles, ethos, pathos, logos, kairos, and telos. Just as a very quick summary, ethos has to do with character and credibility. Pathos is about emotion. Logos is about logic and what you're saying. Kairos is about the timing of what you say. And then telos is, of course, the goal of the purpose. So, John, I'll pass it on to you. Where do you want to start?
So why don't we give a little background, a little bit further background on who the individuals were. Douglas was a former judge, Stephen A. Douglas, a former judge. He was very instrumental in the Compromise of 1850, which we talked about. That's the compromise. He worked with Henry Clay. He worked with some of the other politicians to allow for the admitting into the Union of slave in a free state. But we thought that was going to be the end of it. We thought that was going to be the tail end of the Missouri Compromise. Unfortunately, after 1850, the South started becoming stronger in its convictions, stronger in its demands. They wanted, again, as we talked about, to have the ability to go out of their own territories, the slaveholding states, and to be able to grab these slaves from non-slaveholding states and free states, northern states, and bring them back. So they were forcing Northerners to accept their principles that you may not like this, but you have to honor our principles. So that comes out. Then you have in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, where it's still expanding this principle here too. It's not going away. Stephen A. Douglas is smart in the sense that he's not someone who is necessarily for slavery. What he wants to do, and he figures the future of this is to allow the territories to decide whether they want to have slavery there. He thought it was a fair term, popular sovereignty, because he realized that most of these territories, or he believed, in speaking with some of his Southern brethren, that most of the territories would ask for slavery. Now, I'm going to jump to a principle here too. He would promote that and he would speak about that. And this is where you have the opponent, Lincoln, going back at him, not just giving his own ideas on slavery as to why it's unconstitutional, why the Constitution doesn't allow for it, why we have to stop this constitutionally as opposed to through popular sovereignty. But he actually forced Douglas to take a position that what if the territory decided we don't want slavery there? Would you accept that? Is that something that's under the principle of popular sovereignty? And he said yes. And that was a concession the South didn't like. They didn't want him conceding points, just like we have in modern day politics. Today, when you have diehards on either side, no one wants to concede. You have to concede. If we step outside of what we were talking about here, the Lincoln Douglas debates, and just practically, if you don't concede a point, you don't move on. You and I talked about in our prior episodes learning from debates. Sometimes the point isn't to win, it's to walk away learning more than you knew at the time. And, these two did. Lincoln and Douglas both did. They treated each other as gentlemen, even though they had very divisive points that they wanted to reach, and they were speaking to very divisive audiences like we are today. But they were always gentlemen to each other at the time, and they conceded. They conceded because that's the credibility part we were talking about here.
Well, I like that you bring that up because we live at times where concessions are seen as a sign of weakness.
Yep.
And a lot of the rhetoric that permeates us, and I want to be very, very surgical about this. When I talk about the rhetoric, I'm not talking about the United States, I'm talking about globally. You see this everywhere. As you know, I have the good fortune of doing business in other countries, and it's not much different than what's happening here. The idea that in order for me to grow as an individual, that I have to concede to obtain that growth is seen with not such gentle eyes by many people. And I don't know how we got to that point, but that is exactly where we are. And that could not be any farther from the truth. And I would argue it could not get us any farther from accomplishing great things because as an engineer, guess what? You know what an engineer does every single day when he's put in with a problem to solve and a product has to come out? He or she has to make concessions. You're not going to have every feature. You're not going to have every button you want. You have to make concessions. Otherwise, you're designing forever and never launching the product. This is common sense. This is far more common sense than most people would like to admit. But somehow, in our discourse, we've forgotten that. And when I say discourse, I'm talking about discourse, as a family, amongst, family members, amongst relatives, and of course, in our communities and political arena. So I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that as we go through this conversation and you start pointing some things between Lincoln and Douglas, that we keep going back to that because at the source of all of our problems lies our seeming inability to concede in today's world.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's a shame that people see concession as weakness. We're not here on this platform to openly criticize, current politicians about things, but I think you could read between the lines and know that there are politicians out there. It's mostly politicians that see concession as weakness, um, see losing as weakness, and deny the fact that you've lost. Let's just flip that to where we are with Lincoln and Douglas. And we're not going to necessarily go through the debates, point by point. We'll kind of take them out of order because we want to relate that to what we were talking about here. Lincoln lost the debates. He had 7 debates. He presented very well. And I'd urge anyone listening to this, they have books like the Library of America that actually have all 7 debates, word for word. They were able to actually put together different sources of taking down these speeches and putting them together in one book format. It's fantastic. Lincoln presents brilliantly. Douglas, you disagree with him. Most people would today disagree with him. A good majority of the people listening to him at the time, the audience members, disagreed with him because it seemed like he wanted to nationalize slavery through popular sovereignty. He said it could exist in any territory so long as most of the people there wanted it. And again, that seems to go against, you and I know this. We talked about the founders. One of James Madison's biggest fears was mob mentality. You want to have a layered government. You want to have a breathing government where you're electing officials who then make decisions. taking it away from direct democracies. Because what happened with direct democracies? Ancient Greece, they're violent overthrows. So there was a big fear with Madison. He was brilliant. Big fear with him as to that. So let's layer the government. What this does is you're allowing direct democracy for such a heated figure as slavery, which could be disastrous. And Lincoln said this in one of his speeches. You can't have one house divided, half slave and half free. It's got to be one or the other. The founders didn't think this was going to be a problem. They thought it was going to wither and die on the vine. They stopped the slave trade. They thought with the stopping of the slave trade, it was going to end it. It was going to die on the vine. It didn't. So it's a different problem that Lincoln is trying to address here. But he loses. He loses, and he doesn't go and he doesn't complain. He doesn't say, I want that Senate seat. He doesn't say that all my debates, I won them. Someone should have, put me into the ballot box. What he does is he uses his position there as a platform to be the second Republican candidate for the 1860 election, and it puts him into office. And one of his opponents in that election is Stephen Douglas. There are four individuals there, and they split the vote so much that Lincoln wins with a very small percentage of the vote there. But that's because of this divisiveness. This whole thing we're talking about with this debate, it doesn't stop in 1858. It continues through 1860, and Douglas loses, and Douglas concedes. Douglas loses and he concedes, and he recognizes Lincoln as a worthy opponent, but he also recognizes that Lincoln has some good points to make too. And some of this was politically minded. Some of it was political as opposed to personal issues. And to both of their credits, they didn't take their debates personally.
Oh, very interesting. So what happened then? So they go through these debates. Lincoln loses a Senate seat. They see each other again later on. Lincoln gets the best of him next time. How does this? How do we bring all that into our day-to-day lives today?
Well, what you have then is we'll go back a second. He loses the Senate seat. Douglas gets in at this point. But even in that 2 year period, 1858 to 1860, what's going on in the country? You have James Buchanan, who's still president. Remember, he was the president from 1856 to 1860 at this point. I don't think you can really say a lot of positive things about James Buchanan. I think he got into office and he thought that he was going to maintain the status quo, but he was not in a position to be forceful enough to tell the seceding states and they were in the process of seceding at this point. They didn't officially secede yet, but you knew what they were doing at this point. He's a Pennsylvania guy, so he's on the border. He's not north or south. He's kind of in the middle. And he thought he'd be someone to moderate things, kind of like what Douglas is trying to do. He's trying to walk that fine line, placate the South, but not trigger a civil war, which has been brewing, Raphael, since 1820. I mean, it's only these compromises we talked about, these paper compromises, as you called them, that's all they were. They were paper compromises that someone knew it was eventually going to bust open. And it did. It did in 1860, but it had been going on for very long periods of time. During Buchanan's presidency, he allowed the territories, he allowed certain states to get bloody. There was bloody Kansas going on. Nebraska was bloody. He was allowing states to have their own mini civil wars at the time. He was not stopping the states from, leaving the Union. And if you think back to it, even Andrew Jackson, we talk about where we are now. Andrew Jackson himself kept the Union together, a slaveholding first Democratic president. If we call it the Democratic Party, he was the first Democrat there, the working man. But at the time, unfortunately, he's the working white man. That's all it was. But he kept the country together because John C. Calhoun had threatened to secede through South Carolina back then because they disagreed with one of the policies there too. And he threatened to hang him, and he got him back in line again too. So you had a strong Democratic president then to do that. Buchanan was the furthest thing from it. He probably could have been tried for treason. And we talk about presidents that should be impeached. He clearly should have been impeached for everything he did at this point. So never going to be a good president, never going to be known as a good president. But there's a lot going on there, though. If the Republicans had won, and they ran their first candidate in 1856. Maybe things could have been different, but it wasn't a time for a Republican to win. I think you really needed someone like Lincoln to come in, and everything he gave for these debates here, every point he made, he learned from too. We talk about individuals that don't want to learn. Some of the principles are, let's learn from what we don't know. You know what? Lincoln did that. During these debates, Lincoln was not going to concede that the black man and the white man were equal. He didn't do that for political reasons, but I think for personal reasons too. He wore a lot of his personal beliefs on his sleeve, and he brought it out into his politics as well. And one thing to admire about him is he's a learning man too. And he learns from these debates in 1858 where he didn't see the black man as equal, to when he's president and he's there when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed. Wonderful stuff. He's learning. He's saying, I was wrong back then. Now I want equality. They're not just men who deserve to be paid for their labor. They shouldn't be forced into labor like slavery. They're men that should be treated equally. They should have the right to vote. They have protections under the Constitution now, which we're recognizing constitutionally, which was never recognized up to that point constitutionally. And now you have a populace that always felt that they were left out of the Constitution, now being specifically mentioned as being part of it.
So you said something very interesting. You said something very interesting that I want to zoom out, but then zoom into, right? You mentioned Buchanan, right? And how he was just trying to walk a fine line. I have a hard time, as you know, I'm a student of history. I have a hard time going back into history and finding times where individuals that are in a position of influence and or power walk a fine line to try to avoid conflict, and then things turn out okay. Uh, and we are living in such times today. We have social issues. We have a new generation of young adults who are wonderful, but they're struggling, right? You and I have young kids. Well, my kids are a little bit older than yours, but I talk to my kids and I see the struggle in their eyes. It is a different world. It is a world that is very focused on manipulation and control of, well, to be fair, it's always been focused on manipulation and control. We just have better tools today. So we end up in these situations where we we don't communicate as well as we should. We don't listen as well as we should. We don't read and discern as well as we should. And I think that leads into us being in positions where we can't take action as well as we should. And therefore, we end up dancing this tightrope, trying to not upset this side, trying to not upset the other side, trying to be in the middle, trying to keep everybody happy. And it doesn't work. There has to be, just talked about that, there has to be concessions, but to have concessions, we can't dance around the issues. We have to be able to communicate them. We have to be able to learn when we don't have enough logos, right? Or enough ethos to back up our arguments. We got to go back and retreat, get prepared, and come back better, right? Learn those lessons. Take that growth, whether that's a discussion with your son who is taking on habits that you don't approve of, right? It's about retreating, recovering, relearning, unlearning, getting some growth in, coming back with better arguments, and continue the difficult conversations. We seem to shy away from difficult conversations. And at least in my experience, I shy away from difficult conversations when I don't have proper content to share. But to get proper content to share, I got to be prepared, which means I have to go study. I have to go read something. I got to go ask someone, right? I got to go listen to something. And it seemed like back in those days, people were more focused on that process. I'm not saying that they were better than we are today, not by any means, because again, we have such better tools. But they didn't seem afraid to do the work to prepare for a debate or an exchange of ideas. They didn't seem afraid to retreat and concede, right? And they didn't seem afraid to go back and prepare and come back a little stronger. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Uh, you nailed it when you started talking about the principles, and I do invite the audience members to go back to our first couple of sessions. The ethos, the logos, ethos, remember, being the character and credibility, and the logos being the logic. I think those are the foundations of the arguments. You need the passion, you need the emotion, um, parts of the argument. But that only comes into play, and you only appeal to the audience's emotion if they think you're credible. If they don't believe you, if you're trying to sell them something with all passion without giving some foundation for it, they're not going to believe you. They're not going to like you. In politics, they're not going to vote for you. If they're on a jury, they're not going to rule in your favor. And that's important. You bring up a lot of good points. I don't think we have enough time, today, generally, to slow think. Slow thinking and recognizing you're wrong and recognizing you could change. We're in our 50s. I'm still learning things, and I know you are, and I hope most audience members are. We're learning things in our 50s that either we didn't believe or we didn't know in our 20s. I have a 17-year-old, and I'm trying to tell him, let me take everything in my brain and put it into yours if I can. If you want it, it's here, because I have a lifelong of learning here too. I went through every trial and tribulation, everything you can think of, probably doing here. I've probably done, and I failed. And I think getting to that, though, people are afraid to fail. Lincoln lost. You lose debates, you lose trials, you lose elections, and not to go back to that point again, but why not concede that? You're learning from the loss, though. And if it's better for the party and not the individual, and thankfully we had a lot of politicians in our history that put country before individual and said, I might lose, but I'm going to go out and offer legislation or vote for something that's going to make the country better, even though the people who put me in office may disagree with me. This is the best thing for the country, because remember, when you're electing people into office, they have access to information that you don't. We think we know everything and we can vote on a bill from the outside. We can't. We try to respect our elected officials to do that because they know certain things that we don't. We hope they read the whole bill that they're passing, and we hope they're not just in office to be obstructive and to not pass bills, because that's what your purpose is. Your purpose is there to compromise. That's what being a legislator is. It's proposing something. Maybe it's not the best thing. It's accepting some defaults and some problems that you wouldn't necessarily agree with. But overall, the bill, the omnibus bill, if we call it that, is going to be best for the country at this point. It may not fit all of your ideas. It may not check all your boxes, but we're not looking for bills that everyone agrees with every part of, right? I mean, that's what we want. We want individuals in there willing to take chances, and the biggest chance being losing an election to make the country better. And my concern is I don't see a lot of politicians willing to do that. The ones that are either are not running for reelection or have just given up themselves, and that's sad.
And that behavior gets extrapolated out to every aspect of our societies. We see parents giving up on their children because they
Yep.
can't find a way to communicate with them. We see children giving up on their parents, or young adults giving up on their parents because they can't find a way to communicate with them. You see that in small communities. You see that in corporations as well, where people just like, I'm just going to go my merry way. I'm going to become an island, right?
Yep.
Well, no one is an island. We do not do well in isolation. We do better with a tribe, with a group. But to be part of the group, there's work that has to be done. And I like what you said. We were afraid to fail. Someone was said that nobody ever fails at anything unless you've stopped trying or you stopped growing. Failure is not really a thing. You do something, you get a result. You don't like the result, you go back, upgrade what you did, and see what result you get. You don't like the result, you keep doing that until you keep upgrading yourself until you get the result you seek, right? You either win or you learn. So that I think and again, I'm talking from a global perspective. I see this happening uh, pretty much every first world country where divisions are becoming more and more hardlined. Ideals and thoughts about what is right and what is wrong are becoming more cemented, and people are less and less willing to have honest conversations about what is good for the whole being, again, the family unit, the community, the municipalities, and the countries when it comes to it. So when we go back to Lincoln and Douglas, tell us more about what happened then.
So through these 7 debates, we'll just actually hyper focus and we'll put it under a microscope for a second. Through these 7 debates, it's for a local seat, a local Senate seat in the sense for the Illinois Senate seat. And that's going to have national repercussions, as you know, because that's one more vote for a party. That's going to be another vote for the Democratic Party if Douglas gets in. If Lincoln gets in, it would be one for this very new Republican Party. And just to remind everyone, who are the Republicans? They're nothing like what they are right now. I could say that bluntly, I guess. What they were was they were actually a formation of a former Whig party, a Free Soil party. They were a composite of individuals who didn't agree with the Democrats, who didn't agree with slavery, and who were leaning towards giving equality to black men at the point. We'll say black men because it wasn't even considered giving any equality to women at the time, which is a story for another podcast at this point. So they were looking for that. So they had some abolitionists in there as well. And let's just skip over. This is 1858. What's going on also is you have abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison, who were starting in the 1840s. You have Frederick Douglass. You and I were talking about this off the air. What an incredible individual Frederick Douglass was. I mean, if you want to look at someone here, we could talk about Lincoln being self-made in the sense that he taught himself the law and he approached things legally. He had a legal mind. And when he's going against someone like Douglas, you have a well-trained lawyer who is a judge going against also a self-made lawyer too. So you have 2 different lawyers from 2 different backgrounds. And then we talk about Frederick Douglass. He's agitating from the 1840s on. He was a slave himself. He escaped slavery. He was taught by someone while he was a slave how to read, and he capitalized on that. And he was an agitator for 20 years. 20 years he was an agitator trying to get emancipation. He was pushing for it in the 1840s, 20 years after the Missouri Compromise, and he was still pushing for it through the Civil War. He aligned himself with Lincoln because he saw a kind heart there, and that was the right thing to do. I mean, what a fantastic, and anyone who could get their hands on the Library of America books on his speeches, please do that. He writes his own autobiography as well, but the speeches he gives, tremendous stuff at the point. So slavery is the big thing. You can't get around it. It's whether slavery is going to be nationalized, and that's what Douglas wants to do. Lincoln says absolutely not. It should be dying on the vine. We should be ending slavery. We should be following the founding fathers' positions where they thought it was going to be ending at this point. And we're playing with the Constitution. Remember, one thing we didn't talk about yet, Raphael, is the Dred Scott decision comes out around this time too. And this is on Buchanan's Watch also. And what that basically says is slaves have no rights at all. That the Constitution, in a sense, protects slavery. So you have Justice Taney is Tawney, I think it's pronounced Tawney, is the chief justice there, and he writes this decision himself because he wants to cement this. And there were stories, backstories that he worked on this, where Buchanan knew this was going to happen, that he kind of leaked. We talk about Supreme Court decisions being leaked. I think we actually had a Supreme Court chief justice who was communicating regularly with the president at the time to make sure that I was going to be the final word on slavery. Thank God he wasn't, and thank God everything, went the way it did. And unfortunately, it leads to bloodshed. It leads to a civil war because civilly, the country couldn't figure this out. They tried in these debates, they raised the points civilly in these debates, these 7 debates over many months here at this point, and Lincoln's position loses politically, but the position continues nationally. Remember, he lost the seat, but the positions continued through the time he became president, and they continued through his presidency as well. And thank God it led to where it did. Unfortunately, it resulted in a lot of people dying and a lot of changes needing to be made on the battlefield as opposed to in the Senate chamber.
So if we go back to the Aristotelian model for argumentation, right?
Sure.
And you and I have discussed this. You can basically summarize it into 4 steps. You introduce an issue, cases presented,
Right.
positions are clarified. That's step 2. Step 3 is opponents, take and address each other and challenge each other. And then there are some conclusions. Now, when it comes to politics, which I don't do a lot of politics, but we live in it, so we have to be part of it. When it comes to politics, the conclusions of a debate may not necessarily map to how the audience takes action on that debate, which the action, of course, is they're trying to drive you to a vote, right?
Right.
But when you zoom out in other aspects of society, there isn't necessarily a vote. If you're having a conversation with your wife, you're having a conversation with your son, your neighbor, trying to resolve something. First of all, there's no audience, right? And you have to drive to a conclusion, right? It seems like on both sides, there is a need for some processing of what was said, some processing of what was heard, and some processing of how do we feel and how do we sit with all of that, right? Now, again, in the political domain, we have the opportunity to do that as listeners, right? You mentioned the audiences in these debates, and we have audiences today as well.
Right.
Debates take place, you can discuss them. You can choose to go the easy route, which is the dangerous route of listening to what the talking heads are telling you on TV, or you can use my preferred route to do my own thinking and come to my own conclusions as a function of my own education. But when you're home, you don't have that benefit. When you're home and you're trying to solve some family problems, relationship problems, friendship problems, it seems like you have to shortcut all of that and get straight to what are we going to do? What are the conclusions? And I think that that's where a lot of the problems begin. You mentioned that we don't slow think in today's world. I also would like to add to that and say that we don't slow process either. We have this expectation of ourselves that if you and I are going back and forth on a particular topic, that by the end of a rebuttal, we are fully prepared to come up with adequate conclusions. And I believe that that is a lot to ask to ourselves because we have to give each other the time to process the conversation. We have to give each other the time to process what was said. I'm not sure, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I'm not sure if, the Greeks talked about that specifically, of that time you need to process what was said, to process what was listened. But as I zoom out of the conversation we're having, and the examples that you're sharing with us, it seems to me that that's at the heart of a lot of the problems that we encountered today. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. Let's look at the means and modes of the communication here. We'll go back to the Lincoln Douglas debates as an example. Hours. They have hours to discuss their points. They're discussing their points. Remember, they're presenting their case. As you said, they're presenting their case. They're having it responded to by their opponent. The audience is cheering or booing or hissing or laughing. So there's an interaction. If we think of the triangle there, you have one side, and the audience showing favor or disfavor for one side too. But this is not an immediate thing. This is not our TikTok environment. This is not our Twitter environment where they limit your characters. And what do you do in the limited amount of characters? It's all passion. It's all anger. It's all blurting out how you feel. And I'm going to respond to that. I don't care how you feel. Tell me why you feel that way and break it down for me a little bit too. And that's why something like Facebook or some other communication might be a little better. It doesn't limit your characters. And I think you see more of an exchange on there that is reasoned. And I think your position has to be reasoned. Even if we go back to Lincoln and Douglas, it was a very heated, hateful topic that they were talking about, but they presented it in a well reasoned way. They checked off all the boxes of ethos, pathos, logos, kairos, telos. All those were checked off because they were trained to present things that way. And why? Because they weren't on a deadline. There were newspaper writers there. They would create the story, and sometimes the story would carry to the next town, sometimes it wouldn't. Remember, they're leaving a town and they're slow thinking in between the towns. Lincoln made the best use of his time when he wasn't speaking, when he was on the train, slow thinking. We're losing that ability, Raphael, because now emails have to be done. Clients have to be responded to not within 24 hours, but within an hour at this point. So if you see something online, you got to respond to it. The knee-jerk reaction is respond to it. Some people know that they can hit your triggering point. We call this the reptilian brain. I think you and I talked about this in one of our other podcasts there too. If you're looking to trigger someone's emotion, the easiest thing to do is to trigger anger or frustration or hate or love out of someone. And it's not to say that they're not wrong under certain circumstances. The problem is when you do that, they're showing a weakness there because they may not be able to slowly process what you're asking them to do, and they may be exposing themselves to an emotion when they should be thinking about it here too. It's not all emotion. Politics isn't all emotion. And unfortunately now we have a situation, this election coming up, where a lot of it's emotionally based. Some of it's being pushed by base members on both sides, all pathos. And if you're not slow thinking, if you're not modernizing, if you're not mediating, if you're not slowing things down, it could create a problem. Now, if we just look, for example, at Biden's State of the Union, it was over an hour, and that gave him a time to not just be emotional, but to be practical, to give real life examples. He did. He had real life individuals in there, like what we're doing now at Lincoln and Douglas. He brings in real individuals who are suffering real problems, and he's saying, this is what's going on. That is a good thing. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, it's always a good thing to bring someone in who's realistically suffering from a problem you're discussing, because you're humanizing the problem and you're discussing it, and you give yourself time to slow think it too. With families, it's different with guys. How do guys communicate with each other? They open up to each other many times if they're watching a ball game or if they're watching a movie together, and they start slowly doing that, and you open up a couple of beers and you do it that way. From my own perspective in communicating with women, it's different. They want to be heard. Listen to them. Give your time to listen and offer opinions when they're asking for it. At this point, it's a different approach that you have. with your children. It's very politically heated right now. You have a lot of young individuals that are influenced by TikTok. So, what I do with my own son is he has a position. I said, just tell me what you heard. Where did you hear it? And I'm silent. And I give them ideas because they're very influenced by technology. They're very influenced by what they need. And what I try to instill with my son, hopefully I'm doing a good job, is to say, you know what, before you believe that, look at this source, read. We don't have physical papers as much anymore. If you don't want to read a number of newspapers, look at a couple of sources. He's big into sites. Go to a couple of different sites. Go to a site you disagree with. We talked about news sources. I listen to both MSNBC and Fox. I listen to CNBC. I listen to CNN. I listen to local channels because they're going to explain it to you differently, but they might say, this is where we got it from. You know what you want to do? You want to go to the first source that all these news agencies got their stuff from and make your own decisions on it. Supreme Court decisions, you disagree with it. Okay, you disagree with the gay marriage. You disagree with sending Roe back to the states. Don't read commentary on it. Read the actual decision. You may disagree with the justices, but they all write in a pretty decent way where you can understand the issues there too. Give yourself the opportunity to say, okay, I think he missed it here. I think she got it right here. And if that's what you're doing, it doesn't matter what political orientation you are, you're communicating. I have friends that are Republicans. I have friends that are Democrats. I have friends that are diehard Republicans, seemingly populists. I have friends that are diehard Democrats and seemingly progressives. What I do is I'm always learning from them. I'm always learning something because you may disagree globally with what they're saying, but they may raise some points that I could tell them honestly, I didn't know that, and it gives me a different perspective. I just wish, Raphael, more people were doing that.
So let me throw something at you and see what your thoughts are. So we're talking about here debates, yeah, and how to listen and how to present and all the Greek recommendations on how to do that. And of course, we talked about the Lincoln and Douglas debates.
Right.
There's another Greek, right? Um, Prior to Aristotle that actually talked by asking questions, right? Socrates, right?
Yep.
He never really, as far as I know, he never really wrote any of his stuff. It was Plato who was writing all of his stuff as he was following him around, all these young minds following Socrates around all over Greece and writing his teachings. But if you look into his teachings, he had a very particular way of teaching through questioning, asking questions. He wouldn't tell you this is A. He will tell you, what do you think this is? Right? And that is also, in my mind, something that is very powerful and something we don't do enough of. So I'll ask you, is there a place for that kind of discourse in the Aristotelian debate logic, or was Aristotle more of a present, 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 bring the points, instead of trying to throw a question at the other side of the aisle for them to try to answer, and hoping that you can get them to talk to you in the way that you want them to talk to you and to get to the conclusions you want to get to through a line of questioning instead of a line of statements?
The short answer is Aristotle's not better than Socrates. There was a transition. You nailed it. You went from more theory to practical, and many times when we look at the ancient Greeks, we look at Aristotle as being more practical than his predecessors. But I could tell you from personal experience that the Socratic method works because that's how I was trained as a lawyer in law school. They use the Socratic method. They put you on the spot because you know what? It's time to take the gloves off. When you're representing a client, you're going to be put on the spot. Someone is looking to you to give them guidance on understanding a statute, understanding a principle, understanding an issue of law. From what I do, did I deviate from accepted medical standards by recommending this, by operating here, by not asking more questions. Did I uh, commit legal malpractice by making this recommendation, by blowing the statute of limitations, by doing things? There's not going to be anyone there to protect you. It's you in the line of fire. Sometimes you need to slow think it. And I still do that myself. I may get a very difficult question from a client, a novel question that I can't answer right away. And you have to slow think. You have to say, let me just do a little bit of digging on there. And the clients respect that because they know they're putting you on the spot, because many times your recommendation is going to lead to collateral consequences, either money being paid or not, a trial happening or not, legislation being challenged or not, and monies being spent to go to the courtroom on a position. What do I do in writing? Many times the briefs that I submit to certain courts, they ask that question. Did this happen? And then you're answering the question. So in a sense, you're taking that Socratic method of the question and exploring it and presenting it, and taking the Aristotelian methods and actually answering the question through Aristotelian means at this point. But I think we always have to ask questions. We always have to stop and say, am I doing the right thing? Is this not only legal, is it moral? Is it the right thing here? They did it in the debates. They asked different questions and they gave different answers to their own questions, as opposed to answers that their adversary wanted to hear. Occasionally, as we talked about, they conceded. Occasionally, they were forced to answer the questions that their adversary wanted asked, as opposed to answering their own questions. But if we're not asking questions, Raphael, we're not looking at things completely. Sometimes the questions you're asking are more important than the answers you want to give.
So as we zoom out from all of this, right, we've covered a lot of ground here. If I were to kind of summarize the discussion, it is well known. We know this. It's out there that, and actually let me paraphrase this. There's a saying in Spanish that says, "Hablando se entiende la gente," which means speaking is how people understand each other. But based on, and I grew up thinking this way, and I still think there is some truth to it. But that's just half the story, right? It's not even half the story. Based on what we've discussed today, it seems like that's a third of the story, because it says speaking is how people understand each other. But it's not just through speaking. It's through speaking, it's through listening, and then the necessary and mostly ignored processing of what was spoken and what was listened to. And if we take those three pillars, as you well know, I like to think in threes, three thoughts on everything is about three, the triangle, the trinity, all these different things, right? But it seems to me, right, that that's the triage we really have to start pushing forward in our family conversations and interactions, in our communities, and at the national level and at the global level. We have to be able to speak. How? Well, we have examples of Aristotle and Socrates, either through statements or through questioning, right? We have to listen, meaning calm down, allow yourself to listen and hear what the other individual has to say, right? And then take all of that and take some time, some downtime to slow think, slow process that was said before coming back to try to rebut a particular statement. Is that in your view a healthy way of approaching debate conversation, whether it's at the politicians level, at the politics national level, versus all the way down to the family dynamics?
Absolutely. Um, if you had to summarize everything here and you said, John, give me one statement that might capture everything we talked about here, it would be difficult, but I would say winning is learning. Winning is not necessarily having your position accepted entirely, it's learning from what you didn't know when you entered the debate.
Oh, that is great, and I think that is. I sent you a couple of weeks back. a great episode from one of my favorite podcasts, Hidden Brain, that specifically was talking about that. And it specifically was talking about Lincoln. Uh, and it was talking about how the small wins actually matter. That's another area in communications where we seem to have lost perspective. Lincoln, people don't realize that the emancipation was not an all in one type of legislation.
Right.
It actually was one step that then was followed by another step and then was followed by another step. I encourage folks to listen to that episode in Hidden Brain. It's I don't have any relationship to Hidden Brain, but I just love the work they do. So I'm happy to promote good work that's out there. But we seem to shy away from that too. It's like we want the 100% right now. We want 100% right now. And we will forego a 20% improvement in the right direction because it seems as if it's a loss. And I'll give you another example about that. You and I are both old enough to remember the Montreal Agreement. And for those in the audience who don't remember the Montreal Agreement, that was the international agreement that was done in the 80s to ban or control at the time the emissions of fluorocarbons, CFCs, that were present in aerosols that we knew at the time were having an active role in the damaging of the ozone layer, right? Well, if I tell you that the first pass of the Montreal Agreement, there was only about 40 to 50% of agreement globally on whether that was actually going to do anything or not. But still, people got on board on it because 40%, 50% is better than zero. And it took about 7 or 8 passes to the Montreal Agreement to get to that 80, 90% of support globally to then get under control of CFCs to the point where we don't see them anymore today, right? Today, when we talk about climate change, people seem to forget that we did a lot more with a lot less back with the Montreal Agreement, right? Today, if I say that we have 70, 80% agreement globally, people say, well, what about that 20, 30%? And that's enough to hang on to do nothing. No, it's the steps, it's the baby steps. It's the baby steps, it's that progress of taking the wins, taking the small wins in order to be able to get to that consensus, right? Overall agreement. So, love your thoughts on that.
I think you're right. You nailed it that certain individuals, it's either an all or nothing thing. Certain politicians, it's an all or nothing thing. In my profession, certain attorneys that I know, it's an all or nothing thing. They want to try every case. Some want to settle every case. It's something that crosses a couple of different environments here, and I think afraid of getting a majority, even afraid of getting a plurality or even a minority, get a small percentage and get the win. Take the win and be happy with it because that win is going to build. As you said, emancipation was not an all or nothing thing. It was a building process, and it happened not only because it had to be the right time. If we even let's take some of the principles here and talk about emancipation. Lincoln was brilliant in the sense that he waited for the right time to build it and to get to the point where it was going to be full emancipation. At this point, he had to have the votes for it, but he also had to have the right time for it. He had to have most of the country behind him because even though he believed it was constitutionally right, it had to be passed through the political process. So he's balancing out both of those things at this point. And that's that well-trained lawyer who is self-trained to get there. He knew, he worked from those periods. Every voter out there, whether they had no money or a lot of money, he's seen them before. He's dealt with them at parties. He's actually grown up with them at this point too. And it's very rare to get a politician such as Lincoln at the time who was able to see the world through so many eyes because of his own personal experience there. Uh, Take the small wins. The small wins eventually will get to where you need to be. Sometimes you get the big wins. It's very rare that it happens these days where you get a very big win And when it happens, you could celebrate that if it's morally right at the time. But take the small wins, because the small wins will get to where you need to be at this point. So I agree with everything you said concerning that.
No, thank you for that. And I want to bring everybody back because I want to make sure that I keep the audience here with me. The reason why I brought that up is because our actions tend to mimic the way we think, which also tends to mimic the way we converse, right? So, at least in my philosophy, the way that I try to live my life, I try to manage, again, another triangle, another triangle. I like to try to manage the way I think, which leads to the way I communicate, which leads to the way I act, right? So if in my mind I'm thinking about small wins, then when I'm communicating and exchanging information with people, which is the core of what we're talking about here, I am also going to manage that with small wins. And then that's going to lead to the action that I have to take, which then inevitably I will manage also with small wins. So these are not mutually exclusive. It's quite the opposite. These are completely related, interdependent, and interlaced. And I think it's important for us to recognize that and to do better every day at the family, at the home, with relationships, and all the way up to the national items. So, John, thank you for your time. I want to give you the last words. What do you want to leave the audience with?
Well, it's gonna be a personal thing. You know what a small win for me was? Meeting you for the first time in St. Francis Prep. Who would have thought that someone from your background and my background, very different, would strike a conversation up and keep this friendship going since 19. I think we met, I want to say it was freshman year. So from 85, 86 to 2024, Raphael. I celebrate that. I mean, it's a big win. It started out small, though. What were we going to talk about? What was something that we were going to find a relationship with, and we did. And I love you for it.
Same here, brother. It was a great time back then. And again, thank you for your time. And we'll be talking soon.
Sounds good.